The vice presidential debate finally covers gun policy, plus gun sales start to increase ahead of the election. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today and sign up for our free newsletter. It comes out every week, and it'll keep you up to date on all things going on in the world of gun politics and policy. Now, this week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch. More on that at the end of the show. To kick us off with some of the news of the week, obviously we had the first and only vice presidential debate of the election cycle, and probably the last debate, period, until ballots are cast. And, as far as debates go, it was one of the only ones that guns actually came up as a substantive debate topic.
Yeah. We saw guns come up very briefly in the presidential debate between Harris and Trump, just basically around Trump saying that Harris would take everyone's guns and Harris saying she owns a gun and wouldn't take anyone's guns. And that was pretty much the extent of that entire exchange. But the VP debate, on the other hand, they probably had, 5 or 6 minutes in there of them talking about gun policy to some extent. So, yeah, definitely the most lengthy exchange on guns that we've seen in this entire campaign, even going back to the Republican primary debates. Obviously, Democrats didn't do a primary, so not a competitive primary, at least. And so they didn't have any debates, but Republicans didn't bring it up, and Trump skipped all those debates anyway. But so this is kind of the best we got, I think. The questions were interesting, I'll say. The first one was about school shootings, but it was mainly about whether Vance was the first one to get, J.D. Vance, Ohio Senator, the Republican VP nominee, was the first to get a question, and it was mainly about whether he supports prosecuting the parents of school shooters. I think they were referring to the Crumbly case in Michigan. And then the second question was to Walz about his flip-flop on supporting assault weapons bans. So not bad questions, but also not really not directed at the biggest gun stories of the campaign, I would say. And the candidates went back and forth for quite a bit in a way that I think a lot of people were pretty surprised by the civility of it. Yeah. I don't know about you. I sure was.
That was definitely my takeaway.
Yeah, it felt like a different era, right? A pre-Trump debate, like a 2012 debate, basically. Although, maybe that's overplayed in my own mind. I don't know, because, I don't know, were the VP debates as bombastic or like wild as the presidential debates in the Trump era? I guess probably not. If I'm thinking back to, Pence, I don't think he wasn't. But Vance came up as more of a Trump-like figure and has been, adopted that MAGA style. So it was interesting to see him take more of a Ryan Romney approach to the debate. It seemed to have worked as far as getting people to like the candidates, because both of them came out as more favorable than they were going in. And I think it was just people reacting to the style of the debate more than anything. But as far as substance goes on guns, the discussion was substantive, right? Yeah. But it didn't hit some of the biggest stories. Like they talked about school security, basically. And, I have a whole members piece on this going through. We have a news piece that just details what they said to each other. And then I have a members piece that kind of takes a closer look at the debate. Because at first glance, this is pretty substantive stuff. They talked a while about guns. But on second look, it's a pretty generic debate as far as the things they actually said. There was a lot of cordialness, talking about Walz's son, I guess, experienced a shooting or was near a shooting, and Vance gave his condolences for that. Walz said that he believed Vance wants to solve school shootings just as much as he does. They both kind of talked about wanting to address the issue and stop school shootings, but just having different ideas about how to get it there. And then their ideas about how to get there are pretty much what you would expect from a generic Republican or generic Democrat. School shooting, they said, but Vance's position was essentially, we need more security. We need to harden our schools. You might not like it, but that's the reality. Whereas Walz said this doesn't happen in other countries. For some reason, they centered on Finland.
I was going to say Finnish gun policy came up, which was not in my bingo card. I don't know about you.
I mean, that's not an uncommon. Finland is not one I've really heard much before, but sometimes you'll hear, Switzerland is one that you'll hear a lot. Mm-hmm. Some European country that has a fairly high level of gun ownership, or at least relative to the rest of Europe, and but still has a low gun violence rate. And that comes up, that sort of thing will come up from either side throughout the gun debate. Like, it's not a new idea, but I haven't usually heard it referenced to Finland. But either way, the point was, Walz is saying other countries don't have this issue, and we shouldn't have to have like schools look like high security forts or whatever. So, and he said, it's the guns. It's guns. He wants to ban certain kinds of guns, specifically so-called assault weapons, AR-15s, things like that. And so, that's a pretty common back and forth between Republicans and Democrats on gun policy, especially around school shootings. And then Vance, of course, talked about the inner city gun violence problem in the United States being different from Finland or other countries. And Walz said, it's not about mental health. It's about the guns. These, again, like, so much of their exchange was just exactly what you would expect a Republican and a Democrat to be saying on this issue. And so they skipped over some of the biggest stuff. They didn't talk at all about, for instance, Harris's background on gun policy, specifically her support for different confiscation efforts. Obviously, we broke the story about her 2005 support for San Francisco's total handgun ban, which banned possession of handguns by city residents, outside of a few minor exceptions for active duty law enforcement and military and security guards. And then obviously she has supported mandatory buyback of assault weapons, and so there's really very few firearms in her history, at least her on her record, that she hasn't supported confiscating at this point. There's maybe a few shotguns and rifles in there that wouldn't have been affected by either of those laws. But, this is something that's pretty significant part of her background and what makes her a fairly controversial figure in this debate. And also that she has tried to walk back all of that. Right. Now she says she touts her gun ownership. Walz did that. He did get in that line about him being a gun owner and her also being a gun owner, although he had a number of gaffes, and that was one of them too, it seemed like, because he sort of implied that Harris was also a hunter, which I don't believe is accurate. I think he was trying to say she's a gun owner, not a hunter. But and then he also at one point said, when he was explaining why he changed his mind on supporting an assault weapons ban, he said he was friends with school shooters. When he's since cleared this up in an interview with CBS afterwards, but he meant school shooting survivors, which makes a lot more sense given what he was saying. But yeah, I mean, he was not as polished as Vance, I would say. That's pretty easy takeaway. But they just didn't touch on some of the biggest stuff. Vance did not bring up Harris and her background with supporting various gun confiscation stuff, or question the legitimacy of her turnaround on that. right now she says she's a gun owner and won't take anyone's guns. That's her current position. She says that every chance she can since the debate, with her debate with Donald Trump. So that didn't come up, and Vance didn't bring it up, which is a bit odd. And then, of course, going the other direction, Donald Trump is a convicted felon who can't legally possess firearms. And that didn't come up at all either. Walz didn't bring that up. So, you kind of have some of these biggest storylines as far as gun politics of 2024 go. And while we got a debate that finally took some time to talk about gun policy, instead of addressing those things, we kind of got a generic back and forth about school shootings, school safety, and the sort of policy ideas that we've heard a lot before. So I don't know. What was your feeling on that? That was my takeaway from it. Did you have anything?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think listeners should definitely check out your members piece if they are members, because I think that is shrewd. I didn't think of it in those terms until I read that piece, but it's like, yeah, it was nice to see guns. It's weird that they were relegated to the VP debate and not the presidential debate. But the fact it was nice to see, at least some substantive discussion. But as you said, all of maybe the biggest stories around guns, obviously school shootings. We're coming off of a Georgia school shooting. So that is it's a big story in guns.
It's certainly a fair thing to ask about. The question is a little bit, it's at least interesting, I guess, because it's more about this new phenomenon that isn't necessarily as, solidified in amber as most of the other gun politics out there. But it's interesting to ask about charging parents of school shooters, especially because we've seen that now becoming something of a trend. Right. But, it wasn't even really a question about school shootings and how to stop them. But yeah, I don't mean to downplay school shootings and the policy responses to them and the difference there. Is certainly perfectly legitimate and an important topic. It's just not what I would have thought at first as the biggest stories in gun politics in this election.
Yeah, but like you said, I was just especially surprised to see neither side take advantage of the most potent line of attack on the issue. Kamala Harris's past support for multiple kinds of gun confiscation at different points obviously would be a potent thing for JD Vance to bring up. I haven't heard the Harris or Walz campaign bring up once that he's a felon and can't own firearms. That seems like that would fall right into their wheelhouse where they're talking about, hey, we're the real gun owners. We're like every other gun owner or the majority out there that just wants reasonable restrictions, but we enjoy guns. But this guy can't even own guns. And you've never heard them once, raise that line of attack. It's sitting right there. So it's strange, but
I don't really get, and it's not like they didn't freelance on this. Yeah, I think people get, yes, they were only asked these two specific questions, but one, politicians in debates, that's part of what they do is go up and try to get their own message out, regardless of the question was. And two, that's what they did, right? They ended up talking about all kinds of stuff, especially school security, because that was not the actual question. The question was around whether we should prosecute the parents of school shooters. And J.D. Vance's answer to that question was fine. This is probably a relatively uncontroversial take of it depends on the circumstance. Because I'm sure that's how a lot of people probably feel about it. If the parent was particularly negligent or actively involved in the shooting, then yes. His position was that they should probably be prosecuted in that case. But if not, that's a harder case to make. Then they went into school security, Finland, and all kinds of stuff that just wasn't part of the question. They could have brought up these other topics and they just didn't. I don't know. It was good to have a substantive exchange of some gun policy stuff it's been so lacking to this point. But even the couple seconds that Harris and Trump spent on the issue during their debate at least touched on more of one of the key policy questions of the campaign, which is, will Harris try to institute a mandatory buyback or some other possession ban as she's supported in the past, or is she not going to do that. It may have been a more, I don't know, a less elegant back and forth over that point, but at least it was sort of more on one of the central questions of the gun policy fight in this election. So that was just my main take. It was like, okay, this is interesting. They're talking a lot about guns. They're being very civil and nice to one another, which is legitimately, I think, a good thing. We could use more of in our politics, but it's also like they're not really saying much new here. They kind of, this could have been any Republican and any Democrat in any race over the last decade saying the same stuff.
Yeah, so I think that's about right. But like I said, listeners should check out the piece and see what they think. But obviously, we'll stay on top of what goes on as we're getting closer to the election, whether or not any new talking points arise. I suspect not. It seems like they're pretty solidified in what they're saying, but we'll have to see. But speaking of guns and heading closer to the race, on the industry side, we have some new data showing that gun sales are actually on the uptick. After a long time this year, we saw several months where gun sales were declining, and we've started to see now month-over-month upticks in gun sales.
Yeah, an uptick, I think, is the right word for it, because it's not a huge surge. You're still well behind the record levels we saw in 2020, and even 2021 and 2022 did better numbers than 2024, but it was an increase over 2023, and it was above basically all the pre-pandemic years. So, and it does track more with like what you would expect to see in an election year, especially an election year with such a stark contrast on gun policy, where one of the campaigns is making a ban on the sale of the most popular rifle in the country part of their platform, right? And, I would also say, you could look at either of these candidates and find a number of reasons why somebody would be motivated by guns based on their candidacy, right? You have Harris's, her record, like we just talked about, on wanting to ban all kinds of different firearms. Usually that kind of thing drives people to go and buy guns at a higher rate than normal. And then, of course, Donald Trump and his rhetoric that he's used could certainly unnerve a lot of people who don't like him or who are on the other side of the political fight from him, right? Musing about being a dictator for a day, talking about immigrants poisoning the blood of our country. He hasn't talked a lot about. He's kind of dropped some of this darker stuff from his campaign in recent months as the election's gotten closer. But there's all sorts of reasons that, especially with the uptick in liberal gun owners, that could drive those people to buy more guns.
I was going to say that Wall Street Journal piece we talked about last week's episode. Some of them in that piece cited some of that rhetoric as why they were turning to gun ownership. So
sure. So you can find a motivation to go and buy a gun if you're on either side of the aisle. If you're inclined to buy guns, one side of the aisle, I think, is much more inclined to buy guns than the other. Just political reality. And so usually something like Harris's background, her record, and the fact that she's running on an assault weapons ban is probably more motivational overall in these numbers than Trump's rhetoric. But I think that has more to, and maybe that's shifting. Like you said, the Wall Street Journal piece kind of picks up on this, and we've talked about it a lot. Since 2020, this new demographic of gun owners is, not your typical Trump supporting demographic, but regardless, it's something that we expected to see as the election got closer, and then we hadn't been seeing. Right, we wrote over I think back in June, we're seeing declines. It was not only were sales not reaching the 2020 levels, but they weren't even doing as well as last year, 2023. And so the race was not having an effect. And look, there's, there are reasons why people might not be as worried, and fear over the election might not drive as many people to buy guns. One, 2020 was such a perfect storm for motivating people to buy guns of all different stripes and backgrounds in the United States that it probably pushed a lot of demand forward for years, right? And I think that's what we've seen in these numbers over the last couple of years. But also, I'm sure most people who are following politics and are buying guns based on political news probably also have a pretty good understanding of where Congress and the Supreme Court are at today. The Supreme Court is just handed down a landmark pro-gun decision in Bruin back in 2022. Congress is unlikely to pass anything like an assault weapons ban, even if Harris wins. In fact, right now, the most likely scenario, and this is a close election, so you have no idea how this could go, but the most likely scenario is that Republicans retake control of the Senate. So, it's unlikely you're going to see some huge shift in gun policy, even if Harris wins the presidency, which she also seems slightly favored to do at the moment. But although that's much more of a toss-up, than I think Republican control of the Senate is more likely than or easier call than the presidency at this point. But so people, I think, are maybe less people who are plugged into political news and wouldn't be motivated by guns based off that are probably not as concerned that some of these things are actually going to make it into law and be upheld in court. And that could have an effect on gun buying. And then, of course, the decline of the NRA as a group that used to be able to make these more salient issues and get more attention to them. That could have an effect too. There's a lot of things you could look to, but we are now finally seeing the last 3 months straight an increase in gun buying that you would expect to see around an election like this. So it's not a huge increase, but it is there. It is noticeable.
Yeah, I would say it's certainly a very modest increase, but it is the increase that we've been wondering if it was going to show up or not. And, perhaps we'll see it increase even further. In the last couple of months, we've seen things like, a couple of assassination attempts and things as you've written about before. Gun sales tend to be sort of a chaos meter. Mm-hmm. People feel there's chaos in society. That's when gun sales tend to increase. And so you couple that with an election and maybe we'll see that carry into closer to November. But, we'll have to see.
Absolutely.
Heading into a state story, we covered an interesting political development I don't think I've seen before in Massachusetts, sort of an idiosyncratic feature of their constitution. So listeners may recall back in July, the Massachusetts legislature and the governor signed a bill, this giant omnibus 116-page gun control bill. It was sort of their Bruin version of a Bruin response bill. It was curated directly to counteract the Supreme Court and its Bruin decision, as well as the new test for gun cases. They wanted to craft a law to try to stymie any pro-gun momentum. It was supposed to take effect 90 days from then, which would be at the end of this month in October 23rd. And in the meantime, a gun store owner led a coalition of gun rights advocates in the state to basically circulate signatures, get petitions, because if they reach just about 50,000 signatures, they could have suspended this law before it went into effect and send it to a vote of the people in the 2026 election. So it would have been a two and a half year suspension of this law. Well, I guess the Massachusetts governor was nervous about this effort because she this week issued what's called an emergency preamble, where a lot of states have this, but it usually has to come in the bill as it passes, which basically says for public safety or for some other emergency concern, this law needs to go into effect immediately. And I guess 2.5 months after the bill passed, the emergency arose and the governor issued this emergency declaration. So this giant gun control law is now in effect, and it officially forecloses that avenue that those gun rights advocates were hoping to pursue at the ballot.
Right. Although I guess they can still get the signatures to put this to vote on the ballot down the line, is my understanding, right? Yeah,
they can still try to get enough signatures to, ask the voters if they want to repeal the law. But at that point, it will have been in effect for 2 years versus previously they could have just blocked it from ever going into effect.
Right. So it's a pretty significant move on the governor's part, and waiting 2.5 months until this effort picked up steam sure seems to give away the game.
Yeah.
I guess. But, if it was an emergency measure that needed to go in immediately, why didn't they pass it that way instead of waiting months until it seems there was some credible effort to undo the legislation? But, obviously, I think the fight over this law is going to continue mainly in the courts. They may be able to put it on the ballot, but probably the more immediate effort will be a court fight at this point. But it is, that's a fascinating thing. The governor there, Healy, has a sort of a record of pushing the limits of state law in these areas, because she was the one who, as Attorney General, implemented their copycat rule for their assault weapons ban that kind of just said anything that the Attorney General deems to be a copycat of banned firearms is also banned. And this law actually solidifies that, codifies that measure. And so now she's, doing some more questionable things that I suppose that opinion she issued as Attorney General has stood up to this point from court challenges. But, she's certainly not shy about using whatever mechanisms available to her to kind of expand the gun restrictions in Massachusetts, even over objection from a lot of the gun owners there. So we'll continue to obviously keep an eye on the story, and I expect there'll be a lot of court fights over this coming down the line. But it was an interesting maneuver to see her be scared enough of this grassroots petition movement that she felt the need to go and issue a 2-month late emergency declaration. But it is something she can do, apparently. Although I think they're going to challenge the declaration itself as well. So we'll see what the courts say about it.
I would say the NRA and its state affiliate and the state goal, the Gun Owners Action League, were already filing a lawsuit against just the law in general. And then Goal put out a statement shortly after the governor signed this emergency action and said they plan to incorporate that into his lawsuit and challenge that specifically and try to get an injunction issued. So like you said, we'll certainly stay on top of what comes from that.
And that time gap of 2.5 months feels like it should have a bearing on a case against this emergency declaration. But I don't know Massachusetts law well enough to say one way or the other. So we'll have to watch and see what the courts say.
But intuitively, it would seem to stretch the definition of emergency.
But we'll see.
Yeah. I know we briefly wanted to just touch on the ACLU story. We didn't get to touch on that last week's episode.
You had a really good members piece on this one, right? The ACLU filed a fairly surprising brief in a Ninth Circuit case, right? That was in support of Second Amendment rights for nonviolent felons, right? Like, just talk to us a little bit about what the ACLU did and what their arguments were.
Yeah, this one kind of flew under the radar. But like I said, it is an interesting story. This is a case that we covered. I think you covered it when the 3-judge panel decision was delivered earlier this year. It was a nonviolent felon who had a couple of felonies for drug possession, I think vandalism, who was convicted as being a felon in possession of a firearm. He challenged his conviction. The 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit threw it out and said, as applied to this particular defendant, this felon in possession ban is unconstitutional. The state appealed, and now it's sitting before the en banc Ninth Circuit. And before that's being decided, they're collecting amicus briefs. And one of the people to file a brief was the ACLU, who essentially, it's the arguments we've heard gun rights advocates make about this law, that there's no historical tradition of permanently disarming people who have never been found to be a threat of danger to society. And so therefore, at least as applied, once again, this is an as applied challenge. So they're arguing as applied to this particular defendant, this is unconstitutional and his conviction should be tossed. And basically they're asking the full en banc Ninth Circuit to issue a similar decision. So fascinating, because the ACLU in the past, as we've noted, has traditionally come out in support of most gun laws when it comes to these big cases. They support.
Yeah, they might not file amicus briefs in support of them, but
they did in the case of Bruin.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. It seems like a switch, right? I mean, it just seems like a pretty big reversal. I mean, they do criticize the Supreme Court and Bruin and the Second Amendment jurisprudence, but they basically are saying, well, if this is where the court is, this is what this means, which is not, they don't have to do that. They don't have to go along with arguing on the pro-gun side. Nothing is requiring them to file a brief in this case. And they do touch on, people should really read your full piece, because they touch on all the big questions raised in the post-Bruin era, like, who's included in the people referred to by the Second Amendment, which they also connect to other parts of the Bill of Rights, which is something that, has always been a bit perplexing about, your left-leaning academics on this point. They think the Second Amendment is much more limited than other areas of the Bill of Rights that refer to rights of the people specifically. But and then they go into, the historical tradition. They lay out their view of this historical tradition. And it's certainly not anywhere near the view of the government. And then they even talk about the implications of the government trying to use racist laws in their favor in these cases. So, and they also, they note that this doesn't really have a bearing on the legal fight in this case, but they do talk about sort of the racial disparities that exist in prosecutions of the federal gun laws, which they argue is a big problem as well. So this is a lot of stuff that we've talked about over the years here on the show, and that a lot of gun rights advocates have been, like you said, making arguments about in court for the last several years. So kind of, it's just, I think ultimately it's a fascinating thing to see the ACLU go this direction. And, it's their brief. They may be saying a lot of similar things to what, David Kopel or any number of pro-gun academics have argued in amicus briefs, but it probably has more weight in the Ninth Circuit en banc panel than any other group, I would guess, that's going to come in and talk about this stuff. Just by the reality of a lot of these judges probably have more respect for the ACLU than they do the NRA or any pro-gun group, just from a practical standpoint, right?
Yeah,
it is a very
certainly
liberal
think so.
district. There's a very liberal circuit, so.
But it was definitely a fascinating brief, and members listening should definitely go check out the piece, because I break down, like I said, all their arguments, some of the stats they cite, the practical concerns. It's a very thorough brief. And like I said, it wouldn't surprise me if it proved to be somewhat persuasive to the progressive leaning Ninth Circuit. So we'll have to see.
But we got a couple quick headlines to roll through.
Yeah, we'll just briefly touch on one from the Washington Examiner, talking about the NRA's second big ad buy of the election season. They're now targeting ads in the Ohio Senate race against Sherrod Brown, who's a somewhat vulnerable incumbent. He's not as vulnerable as John Tester in Montana, but they announced a 7-figure ad buy. We don't know how much they're spending. Just 7 figures is all they're releasing at the moment.
So and I think every town has also announced another $5 million that they're spending in new ads. So the gun groups they're revving up now. And this, the NRA's ad buy, unlike the ad buy for Mark Robinson in North Carolina, this one makes a lot more sense. Ohio, Montana, if you've got limited resources, that's where you want to spend it, right, in this election. Yeah. Because as we discussed earlier, Republicans have a good shot of retaking the Senate, which is what the NRA wants to see, given where each party is on gun policy these days. And so, it makes sense to spend in Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is probably going to be in a very tight race. And you might even not need to keep spending in Montana at this point. That race seems a lot less close than Ohio, or even some of the I mean, I don't even know if Montana's going to be as close as Florida or Texas, even though the Republicans are very likely to still win Florida and Texas. It might be closer than Tester is in Montana, at least judging off the polling averages. But we'll see. We will see. We will track it. We will keep close eye on it.
And then the other quick headline I wanted to bring to people's attention comes from Colorado, from the Denver Gazette. Listeners may recall shortly after Bruin was decided, a bunch of gun rights groups challenged a bunch of municipal assault weapon ban ordinances in Boulder, Boulder County, a couple of other small towns in that area. And they actually got a temporary restraining order issued. And it looked like they were having some success in a new circuit that we haven't traditionally seen assault weapon ban get challenged in before. Well, now we have some new reporting. I guess there was a hearing this week where it seems quite likely that those cases are going to get tossed on standing grounds. And so if that is the case, that would be kind of a blow to gun rights advocates hoping to see a new avenue to potentially get that ever elusive circuit split on the question of assault weapon bans.
Well, we'll have to see what the judge does there. Throwing out on standing is would certainly be an interesting move. But we'll keep an eye on that one, because you're right. It is one of those assault weapons ban fights that is unique because of where it's taking place. Right. The rest of them are in very liberal circuits where you're unlikely to get a circuit split developing out of that. But we will see, and we will keep track of all that. But that's all we've got for you guys this week. Phil's play the Mets for the first time in the playoffs somehow. Weird, but looking forward to it. Hoping that we can pull out a win, maybe maybe have some fun at the bank this weekend. We'll see. But that's all we've got for you. Head over to thereload.com if you want to sign up for our free newsletter or buy a membership for exclusive access to some of these pieces we talked about, or to appear on the show in a member segment if you want. Just reply to your member exclusive Sunday newsletter if you'd like to come on the podcast. But I'm going to throw it over to myself now for a little word about the Dispatch. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Olive Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news, in the same way that we do here at The Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.